All right, good morning, folks. Morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Bethany Ellman. I'm professor of planetary science here at Caltech and director of the Keck Institute for Space Studies. So KISS is our Think, Do Tank, a collaboration between Caltech, JPL, and many external partners. Our goal is to bring people together to advance concepts that have the potential to revolutionize space exploration. That's whether it's technology, Earth observation, heliophysics, astronomy, planetary science, bringing people together to do what it takes to advance concepts that are maybe 10, 20 years out, but have the potential to make a big impact. As part of that, we have a competitive proposal where every year people can submit calls for studies, and the study here on exoplanetary environments and particles was one of the concepts that was selected from last year's call. Now, every time we bring together people as part of this workshop, and many of you are participants in that workshop that will happen over the course of this week, we convene a short course on the topic so that anyone in the broader community, Caltech, JPL, this will be posted online shortly so that anyone can come and get this primer on what are the exciting questions, what are the unknowns, and what are some potential paths forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Park, who is one of the team leads for the study, to give further introduction. Park, take it away.
Bethany. Okay, so as Bethany said, I'm Park Lloyd. I'm one of 4 co-leads for this workshop, the others being Evgenia Shkolnik, Joe Lazio, and Greg Hallinan. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction of the workshop topic. We came about the idea for this workshop because of a feeling of an increasing urgency to understand the exoplanet particle environments, especially with the advent of JWST, which is just out there revolutionizing our understanding of exoplanets. And as we learn more and more about them, it's becoming more and more imperative that we understand the inputs that change them, and one of those is the particle space weather. But it's extremely hard to observe. At the moment, it's mostly unseen. The photons are relatively easy in comparison, and thanks to a lot of effort, we now have the telescopes to observe those directly. But the particles remain mostly unseen, and that is what leads to this title for the short course. They are, at the moment, effectively the hidden hand in exoplanet evolution. So we have convened this workshop. That's why we've brought together around 30 of the leaders in fields that are key to this topic to come and think about how we can advance the science of observing particle space weather and get those inputs. They've all made a huge effort to be here, some of them crossing continents, so I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for the amount of effort that you put in today to be in these seats. So this short course will give you an introduction to this topic. We have gathered 5 amazing scientists and educators to speak on related pieces of this. At the end of the short course, you should understand 3 things about exoplanet particle space weather. First is why it matters, what it does to planets. The second is what it is and what causes it. And the third thing you should understand is how we observe it, both here in our solar system and then how we're trying to do it for stars. The structure of this short course is very intentional. You might have looked at the schedule and seen that there's a talk on the fundamentals that comes as the third, right in the middle of the workshop. That is entirely intentional. The goal with this is that the first 2 talks will drop you right into the action, and you will get a sense of why particle space weather is so important by learning how it affects planets. And then that should generate a lot of questions potentially. Hold on to those questions about what space weather is, the details of what it is, because the fundamentals talk will then swoop in to answer those. And then after that, we'll move to the how do we actually know about particle space weather? How do we observe it? So for these talks, I'm hoping everybody will take an active role in creating a learning environment. Please start with silencing the cell phones. If you feel any urgent need to check your email, note that we will have a break at 10:10, so that's after the second talk, and that'll last for 30 minutes, so that's a great time to hop on and see if there's anything urgent that you need to clear up. We will come back after that at 10:40, so it's a 30-minute break, and then we'll have our last 3 talks, which will take us to lunch at 12:30. And the talks will be recorded, so you can always go back and catch anything you missed. The talks will be 25 minutes each with a 10-minute Q&A. If you have questions that are clarifying in nature, that have just, you can answer with a couple of words like, what's a definition for this term, or what's this axis that's missing on this plot, you can ask those during the session. But if you have deeper and broader questions, please hold those for the 10-minute Q&A. So yeah, just as promised, we're going to drop you right into the middle of the action, telling you about what particles do when they impact planets. Our instructor for this first lesson, introducing him gives me kind of the odd sensation of singing the praises of somebody who is directly responsible for giving me a PhD. So I don't know if you're willing to overlook that minor lapse in judgment, but if you are, you would discover that he is widely known for his compassionate and rigorous approach to science, as currently a professor at CU Boulder. He has spent the last couple of years dismantling about a century of dogma stating that magnetic fields are somehow essential to maintaining an atmosphere and a habitable environment around a planet. In particular, he leads a team of worldwide experts who are committed to mapping out what the true role is of magnetic fields in the evolution of planetary atmospheres. So, it is our good fortune to learn about how particle space weather influences planets from somebody who accumulates teaching awards at about the same rate that Mars accumulates orbiters, Dr. David Brain.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks very much to Park. That was an incredible introduction. I was not Park's thesis advisor in graduate school, but I was on his thesis committee, and I'm a stickler at University of Colorado about the first chapter of a PhD thesis, the introduction. I think it's a chance to write a review paper on a topic, which develops a very different skill from the rest of the papers in your PhD. And Park wrote the best introductory chapter of a PhD thesis I've seen in 12 years as a professor. It's definitely the thing that you could hand to the next student walking into the university. So I can compliment you right back. Great, so thanks very much to the organizers for having me here. Like Bethany, I also consider myself to be a planetary scientist, but I have some interests that straddle heliophysics and lately astrophysics as well through exoplanetary science. That said, for every slide that I am about to show you, there is at least one person in the room who is more expert than me. So I look forward to learning through the Q&A and through the other speakers this morning who can correct everything that I say that is incorrect. But let's dive right in. So this is one of 2 slides that I will show that will take the most time to go through, but since we're talking about particle space weather, I want to place that in context with a simple statement that our sun spits out lots of stuff at planets. Let's discuss what that stuff is. First of all, it spits out sunlight, photons. This sunlight is emitted from the photosphere of the sun, which overlying the photosphere is the chromosphere, and then the solar atmosphere, the corona. We can ignore the red line and the blue line here. This is more of interest if we are observing the sun from Earth, but from Earth's surface. But from the top of the atmosphere, we would see a spectrum as a function of wavelength, telling us how much light we get at each wavelength. That spectrum peaks at visible wavelengths because the sun has the temperature that it does. If it was hotter, it would peak at shorter wavelengths. If it was cooler, it would peak at longer wavelengths. This sunlight provides energy to Earth, and that energy can reach all the way to the surface of the planet. But that's not the only thing coming from the sun. You have certainly also heard of the solar wind. Instead of photons, these are particles. And they're not coming from the photosphere of the sun. They're instead coming from the solar corona, the atmosphere of the sun. And how the solar wind gets accelerated is something that we'll maybe hear a little bit more about this morning, and is certainly a very active question in solar physics. The diagram here, I think you'll see a couple of other times this morning. And the distance of each of these lines from the sun tells you something about this typical speed of the solar wind at the time this observation was made. On average, at Earth, we experience solar wind that is around 400 kilometers per second. Mostly protons and electrons, but there's some heavier stuff in there as well. Okay, let's go back to photons for a second, since we've been talking about the solar corona. Here I'm going to call it solar extreme ultraviolet, but also X-rays, energetic photons emitted from basically from the base of the corona and the chromosphere all the way to the edge of the corona. This very energetic light would be way off to the left. Would be way off to the left in this diagram of the blackbody spectrum of sunlight, but nevertheless is an important energy input for planets. Finally, solar energetic particles, SEPs. These are, you could think of them as solar wind particles on steroids, and they have energies that can be considerably larger. And those solar energetic particles are also coming from the solar corona, from the outermost layer of the sun. When those particles reach detectors, for example, they can create all of this snow and static in the detector because they're so energetic that they register there. So these are four basic kind of inputs coming from the sun. Two other terms that you'll hear today are flares and CMEs. I haven't listed them on the slide, but flares are extreme versions of solar EUV and X-ray. I'm not going to say EUV and X-ray for the next 25 minutes. EUV from now on means EUV and X-ray. So flares are very intense releases of solar EUV from stars. And then coronal mass ejections are not photons or particles. They are releases of magnetic field from the sun, but those coronal mass ejections can accelerate particles in an expanding shock front that moves throughout the heliosphere. So SEPs can be produced at flare sites and also in CMEs as they propagate outward. So this is the stuff that comes from the sun. What does that do to planets? That's what we'll talk about for the rest of the time. And since many of us in the room are physicists, let's start with physics. Let's just talk about energy, a very simple concept in physics. This diagram is not as complicated as it looks at first. This is, as a function of time, the MAVEN spacecraft orbiting Mars, which is the spacecraft that is maybe best equipped to study the kinds of phenomena that we're going to talk about this morning and this week, at least on the planet side, has measured the energy flux coming from different kinds of inputs from our star as measured at 1.5 AU at the location of Mars. So we have solar wind ions in blue and solar wind electrons in yellow. And we have SEP ions in green and SEP electrons in red. And there's 6 orders of magnitude on this plot in terms of energy flux. Up at the top in black, solar EUV as measured at Mars is roughly a factor of 10 greater than solar wind ions. So the photons beat everything else, and they beat SEPs by many orders of magnitude as measured at Mars. Finally, this number down here, 6 times 10 to the 5 milliwatts per meter squared, that's this axis on the right. So the solar luminosity, the blackbody radiation from the sun, is up in here someplace. Okay, much, much larger. So particles carry much less energy to Mars than light does. That's Mars. What about Earth and Venus? Let's take this plot from Mars and scale it to first to Earth, which is closer to the sun. Everything changed relative to each other in the same way. Let's scale to Venus. Maybe it changes there. Yeah, nope. That's just me cutting and pasting in PowerPoint and sliding things upward. Everything scales as 1 over r squared, at least in this part of the solar system. As you get closer to our star, that scaling becomes a little more suspect. And even out at this distance in the solar system, the scaling of SEP ions and electrons is approximate. 1 over r squared is thought to be good enough. Okay, so for Venus, Earth, and Mars, photons beat particles. So that brings me to the next slide, which the organizers will find very disappointing. This event is canceled due to the insignificance of particles relative to photons. You all are dismissed. Thank you for coming. Okay, not so fast. So with the rest of the time, I'm going to talk about 4 different reasons that we should not cancel this event. And you can maybe think of others. Number 1, no star is the same. And I mean this in 2 different ways. Number 1, take any 2 stars, and they are not the same as each other. So this energy scaling, photons relative to particles, solar wind relative to SEPs, that can change. And when we talk about planets orbiting M-dwarfs, planets orbiting exoplanets, many of us immediately think of M-dwarfs because so many planets have been discovered around M-dwarfs. And M-dwarfs are less luminous than our star with higher EUV and higher stellar activity. So these 2 plots illustrate those points, at least somewhat. Here's a spectrum of an M-dwarf star, a well-known and well-characterized M-dwarf star called Barnard's star relative to the Sun. The Sun is in black, Barnard's star is in red. Out here at visible wavelengths, the Sun is 2 orders of magnitude more energetic than the M-dwarf star. M-dwarf stars are not so bright, not so luminous. That means the habitable zone around M-dwarf stars must be closer to the star, and that's a whammy in terms of the stellar activity, the solar storms coming from the Sun. And it's a double whammy because at EUV wavelengths, the M-dwarf star is also brighter. Things are kind of muddled with all of these lines, but on average, the red is a factor of several times greater than than the black here. So brighter in EUV, and also you have to be closer to have any prayer of thinking about habitable planets at least. And here's some statistics from a study looking at a pretty large number of M-dwarf stars, showing that as you decrease the size of the M-dwarf, these are the spectral types of M-dwarf, as you decrease the size, you have a greater and greater chance of observing that star flare. Another thing to note is the top of the chart here, 20 to 25%, is where it peaks. They're not flaring 100% of the time, but they're flaring a lot. Okay, the second way that I mean this is that the same star is never the same. So our sun is always changing, always different. And we can look at other stars in the galaxy. And so here are 2 examples that I've drawn from review papers. One looking at the magnetic field of a star as a function of its age. And as stars get older, they decline. There's some comfort for me in that statement. I don't feel so alone if stars are declining as well. And then the X-ray luminosity of stars as well also declines as they age. And models have been fit to observations of sun-type stars in this plot for fast rotators in red, medium rotators, and slow rotators in blue. Okay, one last point here on no star is ever the same. The extreme events. Understanding the cadence and energy of those extreme events is very important for understanding impact on planets, since SEPs are associated with both flares and CMEs. So you can see times here when the energy coming from solar energetic particles spikes, even times when the solar wind itself is very, very energetic. And this is just for our star. What if we look at one characteristic, maybe not characteristic, M-Dwarf star. This is Barnard's star again. It was observed 5 times over a period of 7 hours or so, and 3 of those observation windows had no flaring for that star. 2 of those observations had flaring for the star. One of the flares was an order of magnitude more energetic than the quiescent Barnard's star. You might be tempted to say this star flares 40% of the time. And so the activity and the duty cycle of these extreme events is an important consideration when we're having our discussions. Point number 2, stars drive atmospheric escape from planets. If you know me, you know I'm going to talk about this, and I may spend too much time on this, and I did not start my timer, so I'm just going to talk forever about this topic. But I will try not to do that. I'll try to respect the time. First of all, the term atmospheric escape results from a suite of physical processes. It's not one process that is atmospheric escape. Atmospheric escape is a catch-all term, and the physics are rich. And because it's a catch-all term, because there are different processes involved in atmospheric escape, there is no one answer to the question, is atmospheric escape important? Does atmospheric escape cause that? It's each one of those processes that needs to be considered individually. Some processes are influenced by the topic of this workshop, stellar particles. Some are not. Different atmospheric species can be stripped by different processes. If we're talking about hydrogen from primordial atmospheres, the atmospheres that first form with planets, that's very different from talking about the secondary atmosphere that we all are embedded in right now. For Earth, that's nitrogen. For Venus and Mars, that's carbon dioxide. Different processes can be differently important in those cases, and then at different times in stellar history as well. So it's a complicated, deliciously complicated mess that I enjoy thinking about. There are many diagrams of the different atmospheric escape processes, and Guillaume will recognize this one. It's an excellent diagram, and here the different atmospheric escape processes have been parsed into 10 different categories of escape because the physics are so rich. As I have progressed through my career, I've gotten more and more lazy or more and more reductive. So I'm going to group all of these. I'm going to try and keep all the same physics here, but just talk about things in 5 categories. So the first category I would term thermal escape. And this results because the thermal distribution of particle energies can lead to escape. If you have any collection of particles, then you're going to have a distribution of velocities. A cold collection of particles will have a lot of velocities clustered around the same value. Hot distributions will have a larger spread in velocities, and the average velocity will increase as the temperature of that distribution increases. So you can have atmospheres with different temperatures. The distributions will look different, but the escape velocity of that planet isn't changing in this thought experiment. And so depending upon the temperature of your distribution, a larger fraction of your gas has energy greater than the escape velocity of the planet. That gas then is eligible to thermally escape, or experience Jeans escape, or photoevaporate. All of these terms are used for thermal escape. And a handy parameter to think about thermal escape is called the escape parameter. Basically the ratio of the required energy to escape to the actual energy of the thermal distribution. The lower that number, the more important thermal escape is. We can take an extreme case. Let's move the distribution so that the peak is within a factor of 3 in energy of the escape velocity. Then we have an extreme version of thermal escape referred to as hydrodynamic escape, or blow-off, or outflow, or photoevaporation, depending upon which papers you're looking at. And this occurs when the escape parameter is less than about 3. Hydrodynamic escape is important because it's a fluidized outflow. You can think of densities and velocities in bulk just streaming away from a planet, sometimes entraining heavier species with it as it flows away. Important for light species in atmospheres, for primordial atmospheres. Okay, quickly I'll go through the non-thermal processes too, maybe 2 sentences max for these 4 processes that I have lumped together from Guillaume's diagram. Photochemical escape. Sunlight drives chemical reactions for species in atmospheres. Those reactions are exothermic, giving the particles energy to escape the planet. Ion escape. Ions can be accelerated by electric fields. There are many electric fields. No single electric field term is ever turned completely off, which is why I lump all ion escape now into the same process. Just how much is V cross B? How much is J cross B? Sputtering, big splash. When a particle crashes into an atmosphere, it can splash other particles out of the atmosphere through collisions. Charge exchange, not something I've included on my list very often in the last decade, but I'm starting to come around to needing to include it more. The reason I haven't included it previously is because many times charge exchange results in one of these other processes that we've talked about. If you have a neutral exospheric particle and it undergoes charge exchange with the solar wind becoming an ion, that particle then can experience ion escape. We shouldn't count it twice. But there are charge exchange scenarios that can't be easily classified under these three scenarios. For example, a charged particle mirroring back and forth in Earth's magnetic field, an ion, if it undergoes charge exchange and becomes neutral, then it moves away from Earth in a ballistic trajectory and can escape. That doesn't count under any of these three. Okay, particle space weather can influence escape in several ways. Let's just take 4 of these processes and write a couple of lines. Thermal escape, how do particles influence that? Well, the stellar particles are still depositing energy in an atmosphere, so even though the EUV flux is dominating the thermal distribution at high altitudes in atmospheres, under certain conditions we could imagine that stellar particle input does significantly modify the thermal distribution. Under what conditions does that happen? Under what conditions is this energy input important for thermal escape? Ion escape. Stellar particles influence a lot there. Stellar particles carry energy flux, kinetic energy flux, rho v squared, or dynamic pressure, but also Poynting flux, E cross B. Those are both dictated by what the solar wind particles are doing. Those particles can ionize neutrals at a planet. They can energize those neutrals through electric fields, and they can also deflect, the particles can also deflect atmospheric particles that are otherwise trying to escape. Charge exchange, stellar particles are the source of charge exchange, and when those particle fluxes and energies increase, so should charge exchange. Finally, sputtering. Usually sputtering for planets like Mars or Venus, we think of sputtering as being significant when a planetary particle, like an oxygen atom, becomes ionized and accelerated back into an atmosphere, splashing stuff out. That's because oxygens are really massive compared to protons. But if you give that proton enough energy, sputtering from those solar wind particles may be really important as well. When is that significant? We need to think about that. Last point for atmospheric escape. I promise the other sections are much shorter. It's illegal for me to not mention the role of magnetic fields, as Park already mentioned. And I haven't decided that magnetic fields are unimportant. I've just decided that it's a question that needs to be answered. And so it's not clear whether magnetic fields effectively shield atmospheres from escape driven by stellar winds. It's true that magnetic fields prevent charged particles in stellar winds from directly accessing an atmosphere because magnetic fields turn charged particles left or right, depending upon how they're charged. But we don't need those particles to hit the atmosphere to have consequences, and that's because those particles have altered their momentum when they turn. And they can transfer energy and momentum to atmospheres through things like the Poynting flux along magnetic field lines and other processes. So that energy transfer may actually make Earth a huge momentum collector because its magnetic field is so big. All right, 2 more topics. These will go much faster. Another reason stellar particles might be important is because they can be absorbed by planets. Not the topic of this workshop, but let's talk about surfaces for 2 slides because it's fun and we can look at pictures. Ganymede, Jupiter's moon, has darker poles, has different colored poles than mid-latitudes. This is a little bit disingenuous. I'll explain why in a second. The reason for that is because Ganymede has its own magnetic field, and those magnetic field lines open up at the North and South Pole, connect back to Jupiter. Charged particles spiral along these magnetic field lines and hit the ice, changing the color. Whereas magnetic field lines at mid-latitudes basically protect the surface. This is a little disingenuous because Ganymede also has a leading trailing asymmetry in its coloration as well, and you're seeing probably more of that in this picture, but I like the picture, so off we go. The moon, particles orbed at the surface of the moon. Depth in nanometers for the moon, up to 100 nanometers. I think this is from Chang'e rover. The hydrogen content in the first 100 nanometers of the moon is higher than lower down, presumably because the moon is absorbing solar wind protons, solar wind hydrogen. And it's thought that in some places that's leading to the observations of water absorption features on the moon. Moving on to atmospheres, Mars has a curious helium budget. More helium has been observed to escape from Mars than we think should be escaping if we understand the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium from the Mars surface. One explanation for this is that Mars is also collecting helium from the solar wind, alpha particles, which then turn around and contribute to the escape flux. And people have modeled the helium deposition at the top of the Martian atmosphere. And this is one potential explanation, which implies that the atmosphere collects helium. Woo, off we go. Okay, solar wind protons burrow through the Martian magnetosphere as well, not just helium, and they cause aurora on the Martian day side before those protons are captured by the atmosphere. This is a consequence of charge exchange. The protons would be deflected, but when they charge exchange, they're neutrals and can back and forth, ultimately encountering the atmosphere, causing aurora that must be captured. More speculatively, a graduate student of mine has been distracted by the possibility that Earth captures hydrogen from the solar wind and potentially enough hydrogen to offset any escape that occurs from the atmosphere. So he did a back of the envelope, and if Earth captures 1% of solar wind protons that encounter the bow shock, that would completely offset the hydrogen loss from Earth. Okay, I think I have 1 minute left, so we'll do the last one very quickly. And my prediction is true. The slides that I do quickly are the ones at the end of the talk rather than interspersed. But I only have 3 slides here. Last, stellar particles can drive atmospheric chemistry. So this is a hidden reason that particles are important compared to photons, is because they can influence different parts of a planet's atmosphere. Solar EUV and X-rays influence the top of the atmosphere. Energetic electrons from aurora lower down. Relativistic SEP electrons even lower. And solar proton events, this is all for Earth, even lower in the atmosphere. Now we're getting down into the troposphere and stratosphere of a planet where the chemistry is really important for what's going on deep down. So in the 90s, Kenzei Kobayashi at, I think, Tokyo Tech, I can't remember where they were, took a soup of gas, CO and an H2O, and sent 3 MeV protons into that soup of gas, and amino acids are produced as a result. And I've just labeled 3 of them, but all of these are amino acids. That energetic proton energy input has important consequences, potentially for chemistry in atmospheres. Expanding on this idea, Vlad Erepetian several years ago did kind of a 2-model exercise. First, a magnetosphere model showing that under CME conditions, extreme magnetic field conditions, the polar cap of the planet really expands and opens up, potentially allowing very energetic protons to enter the atmosphere in greater amounts. And this was, just a study of how wide does the polar cap get, and it's assumed that that allows more protons in. And then a chemical model from Guillaume's Exoplanets model shows that the electrons and protons there can take this really strong N2 bond that makes N2 really boring and makes it want to stay together and produces really interesting stuff. It's basically nitrogen fixation without biology that can result. Okay, I said a lot of things. Here are the things I said. I'll start with the last one. There are lots of open questions to discuss this week. And we shouldn't cancel the workshop. There are many reasons that particles could be important, from chemistry to capture to driving escape to the fact that every star is different. Thanks a lot.